He pulled a woman and her baby out of the mud. 3 days later, the town forced him to marry her. But this story doesn't start the way you think. We're just a few steps away from reaching our first 1,000 subscribers, our growing family. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you to everyone who's brought us this far. With your support, we grow stronger with every story. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. As the sun set, painting the earth in rusty gold tones, the wind began to carry whispers from beyond the distant hills. There was something in the air that evening unseen but felt like a tingling crawling up the back of your neck. When Thomas loosened his horse's reins with muscles sore from exhaustion, he had already been alone for 3 days. Along the hunting trail that stretched from mountain paths to the swamp, time passed only by the shifting length of shadows. The pelts of the animals he had hunted weighed down behind his saddle, pressing harder on his back with every step. But none of that would stop him. Loneliness was a familiar guest to him, silent, unforgiving, but honest. With a deep sigh, he guided his horse toward a sloping ridge. When his eyes caught something between the dry shrubs ahead, he thought at first it was just a trick of the light. But then he heard it, just once. Not an animal's cry, nor the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was short, deep, and muffled. Not quite a scream, not a word either. More like the sound of surrender. His instincts kicked in immediately. He dismounted silently, stepping carefully. The cracked earth sloped down toward a dry riverbed. As he got closer, the scene etched itself into his mind like a scar. At the edge of the swamp, a woman was sunk up to her waist in mud. Her body was almost completely buried, arms trembling as she held a small figure tight against her chest. The baby's face was covered, but a tiny foot stuck out from between the fabric. The woman's hair was plastered to her face, matted with sweat or mud or both. Her breaths came in short gasps, her voice gone, but her eyes were locked on Thomas's. She didn't move, didn't ask for help. She just watched, with deep, pitch-black eyes, balanced right on the edge between life and death. "Don't move," Thomas said, his voice low but firm. He threw a rope toward her, but it sank into the mud without resistance. He cursed, scanning the area. He spotted a thick branch that had fallen from a nearby pine, long and sturdy. He grabbed it and dragged it toward her, staying out of the swamp. "Grab this tight," he said. "Keep the baby up." The woman gave a slight nod without saying a word and gripped the branch. As Thomas pulled back, he felt like the muscles in his legs were going to tear. The swamp didn't want to let her go. The ground felt alive, clinging to her body like it had teeth. But he didn't stop. He didn't give in to the pain in his back, the burn in his hands, or the sheer resistance of the mud. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a woman he was saving, maybe it was a piece of his own past. Finally, she came free, still holding the baby. As she collapsed to the ground, the child stayed in her arms like nothing else in the world mattered. Thomas knelt beside them, breathless, but not a single tear rolled from the woman's eyes. She didn't even have the strength left to cry, but she hadn't given up, either. "There's a cabin nearby," Thomas said. "No one will bother you there." The woman lowered her head without saying a word. Thomas gently took the baby first. The child was light as a feather. The woman didn't reach out, but she didn't resist as Thomas helped her up. She staggered a bit, leaning on him for just a second before walking on her own. Quiet, stubborn dignity. They didn't speak on the way. Thomas held the reins while the woman and baby rode the horse in silence. As the last light of the sun spilled across the earth, the night wrapped itself around them like a blanket. The cabin was small but warm. Thomas rekindled the fire he'd left burning 3 days earlier. He gave the woman an old blanket and some cloths to dry the baby. He didn't ask any questions. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were alert. She heard every sound, reacted to every movement, as if survival depended on staying completely silent. Thomas spent the night on the porch, his rifle resting on his knees. The sounds from inside the cabin were more real than the wind outside now. Not just echoes of his own solitude, but the vibrations of another life. And in that moment, Thomas felt it. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a beginning. But of what exactly, he still didn't know. Morning settled over the land like a gray blanket. The sky was hazy, the air heavy. It hadn't rained, but it felt like all of nature was holding its breath. The fire inside the cabin had burned through the night, embers still glowing beneath the ashes. When Thomas woke, curled up on the floor, The first thing he noticed was the silence. The baby hadn't cried, and the woman hadn't left. When he lifted his head, he saw her by the stove. Her hair was braided again, her face washed, but she still wore that same determined expression. As she folded a blanket and placed it on the shelf, her fingertips were trembling. The baby was wrapped in a cloth, sleeping on a small wooden board. Thomas stood up quietly. He stood behind her, but didn't get closer. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough. The woman didn't turn around. She only gave a small nod to show she'd heard him. Thomas moved over to the stove to make some coffee. He pulled out the cups and held one out to her. She didn't take it, just glanced at it from the corner of her eye, then looked down. Another silence grew between them, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of something. Waiting, wrestling, maybe resistance, maybe shame, maybe all of it at once. "What were you doing out there in the mud alone?" Thomas asked eventually. It wasn't accusatory, just curious. The woman didn't break her silence. But this time, she looked at him, directly. Their eyes met. Then she slowly turned toward the baby, touched its cheek with a finger, and pressed her palm against her chest before holding it out. Go, that's what it meant. She'd been cast out, sent away. Thomas lowered his head. He understood. There was no need for many words. The exhaustion in her eyes said more than anything could. "Some people don't find a place in this world," Thomas said. "But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them." The woman turned her head to the window. Outside, the silhouettes of trees, rocks, and broken fence posts stood still in the mist. The place felt like a forgotten piece of time. No weight of the past, no promise of the future, just the now and the urge to survive. By midday, Thomas went outside to chop wood. With every swing of the axe, as the blade broke the frozen ground, his thoughts got messier. The woman wasn't leaving, but she didn't seem to want to stay either. She was somewhere in between, on the edge, just like him. Thomas had been living on that edge ever since he buried his wife years ago. Not fully alive, not fully gone. When he returned to the cabin, there was a smell inside. Something was boiling. The woman had placed a small pot on the stove in the corner. He didn't ask what it was. She didn't say. But that, right there, was a first step. A silent agreement. Thomas knelt by the cradle. The baby opened its eyes for a moment. And when it looked at him with that dull but innocent stare, he felt something twist deep inside. A life that wasn't his blood, but needed him. He found himself thinking, why am I doing this? Then, just as quickly, another thought. But if not me, then who? As night fell again, Thomas cleaned his rifle. The woman, while the baby slept, was weaving yarn into a baby blanket. A thin piece of cloth with carefully drawn patterns. Handmade. Memory work. What's her name? Thomas asked. This time, an answer came. The word from her lips was short but strong. It meant something had roots deep somewhere. Thomas tried to repeat it, but his tongue stumbled. The woman smiled, just a little. For the first time, the smile stayed on her lips, but something flickered in her eyes, a kind of acceptance. My name's Thomas, he said softly. People call me Tom. She didn't reply, but she didn't look away anymore, either. In the early hours of the morning, a few prints marked the ground outside the cabin. Horse hooves. In the distance. The woman heard it. She knew. Thomas heard it too. A life of hunting had given him the sense for approaching shadows. Someone's coming, he said. The woman turned her head, as if she'd been expecting it, as if she already knew. And in that moment, Thomas understood. This wasn't a story that would end with only his decision. The first seeds had been planted, and the town, with all its shadows, was drawing near. The rain had started tapping lightly on the tin roof that night, first with thin, hesitant drops, then more firmly, more rhythmically. Thomas hadn't slept. He'd cleaned his rifle, counted the baby's breaths, watched the woman's quiet movements. That woman, the one whose name he still didn't know, whose words he'd barely heard, had become more visible in the silence. No longer like a shadow, but as a presence. Real, resilient, fragile, but not broken. After feeding the baby near dawn, the woman adjusted the blanket she had laid by the child's side. Thomas could now see the patterns on it more clearly. Symbols. Something tied to the past. A reminder of roots that didn't return to the ground. Right then, a sound outside made Thomas tense. Hoofbeats much closer this time. 3, maybe 4 horses. It wasn't just the wind arriving anymore. There was a visible, breathing threat outside. He silently took his gun, looked at the woman. She met his gaze. No fear in her eyes, only a kind of readiness. As if it had happened before. As if she'd lived this moment already. As if everything that had happened to her was about to happen again. He could hear the horses breathing outside the door. The boards creaked. A voice came controlled, but with a buried anger. Thomas. The voice was familiar. The town preacher. The kind that tries to sound soft, but carries stone-cold judgment underneath. Thomas cracked the door open. 4 people stood there. The preacher, a woman he didn't recognize, a man in a red vest, and another rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes cold and distant. "We won't trouble you," said the preacher. "But we heard. There's a woman and a child in there." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I tried to help. They were near death." "We understand," said the preacher, though his face didn't. "It's just, they can't stay here. An unmarried arrangement like this. It's a hard story to explain." "There's nothing to explain," said Thomas. "I don't owe anyone an answer." "Is that so?" The man in the red vest cut in. "The town watches over this area for safety. Who stays and who goes, that's our call." Thomas's fingers tightened around the rifle grip, but he was still calm. He turned back and looked at the woman. She was standing, baby in arms. No fear in her eyes. She was ready, but not to run, to stay and fight. The preacher stepped closer, voice lower now. "Look, the town is talking. A woman, a man, a child. No marriage. Judgment comes fast. We'll return tomorrow with the papers. Make it official or the people will take matters into their own hands." Thomas said nothing, just lowered his head and shut the door. The sound of it closing was quick, but sharp. Inside, the woman was waiting. Her eyes were still steady, but something inside her was trembling now. Thomas slowly took off his hat, laid it on the table, and simply said, "They came sooner than I thought." The woman took a step forward, held the baby tighter. Then as she placed the child in the cradle, she looked into Thomas's face. For the first time, for the first real time, there was a flicker of trust in her eyes. Small, almost invisible, but it was there. And a warmth spread through Thomas. Not affection, not possession, just responsibility. And responsibility, more often than love, is the heavier bond. As the night deepened, the rain came harder. In that quiet cabin, the woman whispered melody songs in an old language, one Thomas would never understand but could still feel. Her voice blended with the baby's breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the footsteps of danger drawing closer outside. And now Thomas knew, the choice had already been made. The moment she walked through that door, fate had been set. Now, it just had to be defended. The next morning was smooth but cold, the sky gray like a sheet of steel, the wind sharp as a blade. The ground in front of the cabin was wet and heavy after the night's rain. Thomas had woken at first light, lit the stove, and brewed coffee. He'd wiped the condensation from the window a few times, scanning the distant hills. No one had come yet, but they would. He knew it. The woman had braided her hair and tied the baby to her back. Her eyes were still alert, but the sense of being a stranger had started to melt. She no longer touched the things in the room like an outsider, but like a cautious resident. Every move was measured, quiet. But when a woman is quiet, it's not always out of fear. Sometimes it's resistance. Thomas had figured that out. Before breakfast, a sound came from outside. That deep, telling sound of weight pressing into rotted boards. No knock this time, the door opened directly. It was the sheriff. With him were 3 others. No preacher this time. These men were simpler, but more dangerous. There were no prayers in their eyes, only decisions. "Thomas," said the sheriff, his voice neutral but close to the edge. "If this conversation's going to stay friendly, you'll need to move that rifle away from the table." Thomas turned slowly, didn't touch the gun, just nodded and stepped back. He glanced at the woman. She was holding the baby on her back, but her eyes were no longer afraid. Her eyes were ready. "There's talk in town," the sheriff said, stepping in a bit. "About who this woman is, why she's here, why. You're not married." Thomas's voice was calm, but there was a stone of anger buried under it. "I pulled them from the edge of death. They were dying." "No one's questioning your intent," said the sheriff. "But intent doesn't matter much anymore. People are talking. There's a child involved. This can't keep going like this." The man in the red coat stepped forward, one of the same from before. "This isn't helping, it's claiming. And we don't want decisions about who stays and who doesn't to be made behind closed doors." The woman stepped forward then. Thomas moved like he might stop her, but didn't need to. She stood tall. The baby on her shoulder slept. but her face. Her face held the quiet resistance of someone who's been in exile for years. "She's never spoken," said the sheriff. "Never defended herself. We don't know anything about her." That's when Thomas spoke. "She has a name. She has a past. You just never gave her space for it." The sheriff nodded. "Look, no one wants trouble, but the rules are the rules. If she's staying here, it needs to be official. Otherwise, Another exile?" Thomas asked. Again, his voice cracked then, not shouting but not hiding his anger either. Silence followed. Long, hard. Then the sheriff said, "Tomorrow morning. The preacher's coming with the papers. The marriage will happen. If she's staying, it'll be as your wife. Otherwise, you both need to leave." They left. When the door closed, even the air inside felt different. The woman didn't speak. Neither did Thomas. Even the baby's sleep looked deeper, like the storm had finally moved beyond the door. But that night, for the first time, the woman spoke by her own will. She said her name. It was simple, strong. Thomas repeated it wrong. She corrected him, smiled just slightly, and one of the walls inside Thomas cracked. Later that night, as Thomas put the baby to sleep, the woman's eyes filled with tears. Quietly, she didn't cry, but her eyes shone. Thomas sat by the stove, saying nothing, just sitting with her silence. Then he said gently, "I'm not doing this marriage to shut them up. Seeing you here, it feels right." The woman lowered her head. Her tears didn't fall. She buried them inside. And that night, for the first time, they shared their silence together. Staying wasn't just an obligation anymore. It was starting to feel like a shared choice. But the town wouldn't know that. They wouldn't want to know. And at dawn, it wouldn't be a blessing that arrived, it would be a weighing. Dawn didn't come quietly that morning. The sky was gray, but it carried tension. As if even the sky already knew the judgment the town was bringing, already felt the weight of the decision. The ground was still wet. The grass bowed under the night's dew. Inside the cabin, it was warm but frozen with anticipation. Thomas sat by the stove, his hands clasped on his knees. The old stool, held together with nails, didn't even dare creak. The woman was in the back room, quietly getting ready with the baby. There would be no ceremony today. No music would play, no prayers would rise into the air. This wasn't a celebration. It was a ritual of conditional forgiveness. There was no knock at the door. As always, the preacher stepped across the threshold, his shoulders squared, his face stern. Behind him came a woman carrying a bundle of white fabric. The sheriff was there too, hat removed but not out of respect, just habit. The others 3 more people from town followed, but said nothing. They were observers, silent witnesses. Maybe even the weight of witnessing made them uncomfortable. When the woman came out from the back, the air in the cabin changed. The baby was tied tightly to her back. Her hair was braided. The dress they'd brought her white, but a reflection of a past that didn't belong to her. The stitching didn't fit her body. The shoulders too wide, the waist too narrow. But she wore it like armor. She walked in it without losing herself. Thomas stepped across from her. His eyes locked on hers. This was a wedding held under society's watch, but in their eyes, there was a vow. Silent, accepting. The preacher began the ceremony. In the presence of God. No one had really wanted to invoke God, but they did anyway, because it was the only way they could legitimize things in their own conscience. The preacher spoke, and Thomas nodded. When it came to the woman, no words were required. She only bowed her head. A silent yes, but not empty. A yes full of resolve. 2 silver rings were brought out. Not blessed, just plain, cold metal. When Thomas placed the ring on her finger, she didn't flinch. She accepted it. When the preacher closed the book, he said, "From this moment forward, you are husband and wife in the eyes of God. Let no one break this union." The words echoed not like an ending, but like a warning. One of the onlookers clenched his jaw. Another lowered his head. A woman glanced at the baby, then quickly looked away. No one clapped. No one said congratulations. When the door closed softly behind them, only Thomas, the woman, and the small child remained. And a tired but newly rebuilt quiet. The woman went to the back. She removed the dress, put her own clothes back on. When she returned to the room in her mud-stained, thread-worn dress, she approached Thomas directly for the first time. There was no hardness in her face, no anger, no pride, just a look that didn't thank, but didn't forget either. Thomas placed a small wooden box on the table. He opened the lid. Inside was a baby rattle. It wasn't finished yet. On it, etched with the tip of a knife, was the name she had given. The woman took the rattle into her hands. Her fingertips traced the grooves. She read the name again with her fingers. And then, for the first time, she placed her hands over Thomas's. A short, simple, but intentional touch. That touch meant more than a kiss, more than an embrace. No one knew what would happen next. Just because the town went quiet didn't mean the danger was gone. Silence can be sharper than a blade. But in that moment, inside the cabin, there was trust. Strong, fragile, but alive. They didn't talk that night. The woman hummed melodies while she put the baby to sleep. Thomas kept carving the rattle. The crackle of the fire had become the sound of life itself. And outside, the wind had started again. But now, there was no space left for it to enter. The cabin walls were still thin, still marked with little cracks, but inside was finally a home. At night, the warmth inside the cabin had turned into a strange kind of tension. The baby's breathing was fast. When Thomas touched the baby's skin, he suddenly noticed the cold sweat beading on the little forehead. The woman was already at the baby's side, trying to dry the scalp with her palm, but her eyes were no longer calm. Something was wrong, and Thomas knew it with the instincts of a man who had spent years in hunting, in solitude, and close to death. "Too hot," he said quietly. The woman nodded. No more herbs. No roots left to boil. Thomas stood up immediately. It was the middle of the night, but time didn't matter anymore. These weren't hours, they were heartbeats. He grabbed the saddle, slung the rifle across his back. The woman didn't ask, didn't try to stop him. They locked eyes. "I'll come back," was all Thomas said. She bowed her head. It wasn't approval. It wasn't surrender. It was just trust. It took him an hour to reach town, but Thomas wasn't racing against time, he was racing against death. The shop shutters were still down, but old Ellis's pharmacy was still lit. When Ellis opened the door and saw the look on Thomas's face, he didn't ask anything. "What do you need?" he asked. Thomas held out a small pouch of money in his palm. "Just the cold root. Dried if you don't have fresh." Ellis handed over the jar from the shelf. But as Thomas turned to leave, 3 men appeared in front of him. Maybe not the town's voice, but certainly its teeth. One of them was familiar. The man in the red vest. "Medicine? For her? For that thing you're raising in our town?" Thomas stopped. His body didn't move, but his eyes hardened. The man kept talking. "We wrote your name in the book, but hers? Still just a shadow. You bring her here as a threat to us." He didn't let the last sentence finish. His fist landed square at the man's jaw. When he hit the mud, his face was already bloodied. The others reached for their belts, but Thomas didn't even touch his rifle. He said it with his stance. "Take one more step, and you're getting buried." When the sheriff arrived, the street had gone quiet. The man was getting up, the others had backed off. The sheriff looked at Thomas. "Fever?" Thomas nodded. The sheriff crouched, didn't lift the man, but took a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his bloody mouth. "Enough's been said," he muttered. "Go home." Thomas turned, kicked the horse forward. All the way back, only one thought pulsed in his mind. "I have to make it in time." When he got to the cabin, the woman was still there. Her eyes were red, but she was awake. The baby in her arms, half-lidded eyes. Breathing weak but breathing. Thomas handed her the jar. She got to work right away. It was the first time Thomas noticed her hands shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion. Hope still lingered inside. They dropped the herbal mixture into a spoon, bit by bit, and gave it to the baby. No reaction on the first try. Second, third, tiny lips parted. Then, silence. Breathing. Deep, slow, peaceful breathing. Thomas sat down on the floor, leaned his back against the wall, let out a long breath. His eyes welled up. After placing the baby in the cradle, the woman came to him. Without a word. This time, she made the first move. She dropped to her knees and rested her head on Thomas's chest. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. Then slowly, he placed one arm on her shoulder, the other around her back. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't surrender. It was two tired souls finally meeting in silence. That morning brought no threat. When the sun rose, the woman looked at Thomas. Her eyes were open but different. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't hesitating. She reached out and took Thomas's hand in hers. For the first time, she said something. She spoke his name. Tom, one word, but the kind that changes a life. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. In his eyes, a whole new world had already formed around that one word. And outside, The wind had finally gone quiet. The story ends here. But this isn't a final closing, it's a quiet beginning. A life built not on grand gestures, but on quiet trust shared between two lonely souls, inside a home that stands steady against the judgment of the town. By the way, we noticed something small. Most people who watch these stories aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Maybe we get caught up in the moment, or just forget to hit the button. But your support truly helps us keep creating stories like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel.